The small town in Vermont was quiet most of the year, the kind of place where people noticed everything and said even more. That morning, the chatter outside the only grocery store echoed through the frosty air. Women stood near the entrance, arms folded, voices lowered but sharp, while men shifted their boots in the gravel, pretending not to listen but catching every word. The topic was the same in every corner. Richard Carter had finally walked out on his wife. "Can you believe it? After all she did for him," one woman whispered, shaking her head. "He should have drowned that night," another muttered, her words sharper than the wind. "Olivia saved him, and this is how he repays her." The gossip buzzed like hornets, harsh and relentless. It had been 3 years since the night Olivia Carter's life had changed forever. She had seen Richard stumble onto the frozen river after too many drinks at a neighbor's barn party. By the time she reached him, the ice had cracked, plunging him into the black water below. She should have called for help, but there was no time. She ran straight onto the ice, fighting against the freezing wind, clawing her way to him. Somehow, she managed to pull him up, to push him onto the edge of the broken ice. But in the process, a heavy slab gave way beneath her, pinning her lower back against the sharp edges. By the time neighbors rushed to help, it was too late. Olivia was alive, but her spine was injured, her strength stolen from her. At 33, she found herself living in a body that betrayed her. Some days, she could manage small movements around the house. Other days, especially when storms rolled across the Green Mountains, pain would force her back into bed, her eyes clouded with dizziness. At first, Richard had stayed. He brought her meals, checked on her, even sat by her bedside in silence. But it wasn't long before patience wore thin. Richard was only in his mid-30s, strong and restless. He began to disappear at night, claiming he needed space, that he couldn't watch her suffer. Whispers around town said he had company on the other side of the river, but Olivia tried to believe otherwise. Until the morning, he stopped pretending. That day, the house was cold, the stove untouched. Olivia lay propped against a pile of pillows, the light from the window casting pale shadows across her tired face. Richard stood in the middle of the room, shoving clothes into a worn duffel bag. His jaw was set, his eyes empty of anything resembling love. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling, "please, don't leave me like this. How am I supposed to manage?" He zipped the bag and turned to her, his voice cutting like glass. "I've done enough, Olivia. I sat here for years, watching you waste away. I can't live like I'm in a prison anymore. I'm a young man. I need a normal woman, someone who can walk beside me. Do you understand? Normal." The word hung in the air like a slap. Olivia pressed her lips together, refusing to give him the satisfaction of tears. Her hands gripped the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. "And what am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You'll figure it out. There are places for people like you. Nursing homes, assisted living. They'll take care of you, better than I can." He walked to the kitchen counter, pulled out his wallet, and tossed a few bills onto the table. They fluttered to the floor, pitiful scraps of green. "That's all I've got on me. Won't do much good anyway. You can't walk to the store." Her eyes burned, but she blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. She wouldn't break in front of him. Not now. Not when he was already halfway out the door. Richard slung the bag over his shoulder and paused at the threshold. For a moment, he looked back, but there was no regret in his eyes, only relief. "You should thank me, Olivia. Most men wouldn't have stayed as long as I did." The door slammed, and the silence that followed was heavier than the pain in her spine. Olivia closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She had saved his life, and in return he had shattered hers. Alone in that small Vermont farmhouse, she clutched the blanket to her chest, forcing herself not to cry. Later, when no one could see, she would let the tears come. But for now, She sat in the silence, her heart breaking, and the world outside whispering about the woman Richard Carter had left behind. The farmhouse was wrapped in silence after Richard's departure, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing, watching, echoing in the hollows of Olivia's chest. The lamp in the living room burned low, casting shadows along the wooden walls. She hadn't moved from her place on the couch, pillows stacked high behind her back. Every muscle ached, but the pain was nothing compared to the emptiness Richard had left behind. Sometime after nightfall, a sudden knock rattled the front door. Olivia flinched, her heart racing. No one ever came this late, not in their quiet town. The knock came again, steady and unhurried. "Hello," a man's voice called, rough but not threatening. Olivia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. Slowly, she shifted toward the door, her steps labored and stiff. She leaned against the wall, her breath shallow, and cracked the door open just enough to see. A stranger stood on the porch. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed from miles of walking. He carried nothing but a small canvas bag slung over his shoulder. His face was rugged, lined from years that hadn't been kind, but his eyes, steady and searching, held no malice. "I don't mean to bother you," he said, raising his hands as if to show he carried no threat. I need a place to sleep for a night, or even the barn if you'd allow it. I can pay a little." He dug into his pocket and held out a few crumpled bills. Olivia stared, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to send him away, to lock the door. But behind the fear was something else, a voice that whispered of the loneliness that had weighed on her for years. And something in his eyes, a flicker of honesty, stilled her hand. You're not from here," she said softly. He shook his head. "Name's Matthew Hayes. I just got out of prison a few weeks ago. Manslaughter, if you're wondering." His words landed heavy in the quiet, but he didn't look away. "It was a fight gone wrong. A man jumped us, me and my wife at the time. I hit too hard. By the time I got out, she'd moved on. Guess I don't blame her. I don't have family left. Just trying to start over somewhere nobody knows my name." Olivia's breath caught. Prison. It should have been enough to send him off the porch. But his tone was calm, without excuses, and his eyes didn't shift like a liar's would. "I don't usually let strangers in," she whispered. "I understand. I'll be gone by morning." He stepped back, already turning away, as if prepared for rejection. And yet, before she knew it, the words slipped from her lips. "Wait, there's a spare room. If you don't mind, it's plain." Matthew froze, then turned, almost disbelieving. "Are you sure?" She nodded faintly. "It doesn't matter anymore. Come in." Inside, he moved carefully, setting his bag down without a sound. He glanced around the modest kitchen, the old wood stove, the thin curtains. "You live alone?" Her throat tightened. "I do now." He didn't pry further. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves, washed his hands at the sink, and said, "If you've got anything in the fridge, I can make us something. Haven't cooked in a while, but I remember enough." Olivia blinked. Richard had never once offered to cook for her, not even when she'd been in the worst of her pain. And here was a stranger, a man with nothing, offering to make her dinner. She wanted to refuse, to insist she wasn't hungry, but her stomach betrayed her with a low ache. So she nodded. "There's bread, a few eggs, some vegetables." Within minutes, Matthew had the pan sizzling, the smell of onions and butter filling the small kitchen. Olivia watched from the couch, her eyes damp, her chest tightening with something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, sadness, maybe hope. When he brought over 2 plates, he didn't just set hers down. He pulled a small cutting board from the counter, laid it across her lap like a tray, and gently placed the plate on top. "There," he said simply. "Easier this way." Her throat closed. Richard had never thought of such a thing, never asked if she was comfortable. She managed a shaky smile. "Thank you." They ate in silence for a while. broken only by the soft crackle of the stove. At last, Matthew leaned back in his chair, looking at her with a half-smile. Funny, isn't it? Two broken lives crossing paths in the middle of Vermont. Olivia lowered her eyes, but for the first time in years, she felt less like a burden and more like a person someone truly saw. The following weeks shifted like the slow thaw of winter into spring. Matthew, true to his word, didn't linger idly in Olivia's farmhouse. At dawn, he would step into town, asking around for work, anything that would keep his hands busy and earn him enough to pay his way. By the second week, the hardware store owner sent him toward a carpenter who needed extra help repairing barns. Soon after, the town's contractor had him hauling lumber and mixing cement for new foundations. It wasn't glamorous, but Matthew worked with a quiet determination that people couldn't ignore. His back bent beneath heavy beams, his hands blistered and raw, but he never complained. "A man's got to earn his place," he'd tell anyone who asked. And each evening, no matter how tired, he came back to Olivia's farmhouse carrying groceries, or sometimes a small bag of flour, sugar, or coffee he'd bought with his wages. Inside those wooden walls, life began to take on a rhythm Olivia hadn't felt in years. Matthew would start dinner while she peeled vegetables at the kitchen table, the two of them talking in easy fragments about the day. He insisted on sweeping the floors, chopping wood for the stove, and fixing the leaky faucet Richard had ignored for years. When Olivia protested, he only smiled. "You've done enough carrying the weight of someone who didn't deserve you. Let me handle the rest." At first, Olivia didn't know how to respond. Gratitude lodged in her throat like a stone, and yet she found herself laughing, really laughing, when Matthew cracked jokes about the stubborn chickens that chased him around a neighbor's yard or the old carpenter who swore at every crooked nail. The sound startled her. She hadn't heard her own laughter in so long that it felt foreign, but the more she laughed, the easier it came, like a muscle remembering how to work. Still, the town noticed, and in a small Vermont village, nothing stayed secret. At the general store, two women lingered near the checkout line, their voices just loud enough to carry. "She's letting that ex-con live under her roof, you know." "Dangerous, if you ask me," the other replied, narrowing her eyes. "Prison changes a man. She's a fool if she thinks he's staying out of trouble." Their words rippled across town like wind through leaves. Soon everyone had an opinion. Some whispered that Matthew was only biding his time, waiting to take advantage of a vulnerable woman. Others wondered if Olivia, lonely and broken, had lost her sense. On Sundays, when Olivia struggled to make her way to church, she felt the stares. Conversations hushed as she passed. Heads leaned close together. Even her old neighbor, Mrs. Hensley, stopped by one afternoon and said with a frown, "Honey, you don't know who he really is. Men like that, they don't change." Olivia listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't argue. She simply nodded and thanked Mrs. Hensley for the concern. But when the door closed behind her neighbor, Olivia let out a long, steady breath. She knew what people thought. She knew their warnings came from a place of fear, and maybe even from love. But fear had already ruled her life long enough. With Richard, she had lived in fear of abandonment, of never being enough, of waiting for affection that never came. With Matthew, there was no fear. There was honesty even in his flaws. Late one evening, after Matthew had finished scrubbing the dishes, Olivia watched him quietly from her place on the couch. The lamplight softened the hard edges of his face, revealing not just the man who had spent years behind prison walls, but someone carrying a burden of regret and a hunger for redemption. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked suddenly. He turned, drying his hands on a rag. "Because I can. Because I should. Because for once, I'd like to put something good back into this world." Her chest tightened, and she swallowed against the emotion rising in her throat. Richard had never said anything close to that in all their years together. He had taken her sacrifices for granted, dismissing them as duties rather than gifts. Matthew, with his past scarred and his future uncertain, was showing her a kind of kindness she hadn't known existed. For the first time since the night on the river, Olivia let herself imagine that life could be different, not easier, not without struggle, but better. And that fragile thought, blooming quietly in her chest, was enough to make her smile long after Matthew had gone to bed. It was Matthew who finally broke the silence one night. They were sitting at the kitchen table, a plate of cornbread between them, when he looked at Olivia with that steady gaze of his. "You need to see a doctor again," he said simply. Olivia froze. "I've seen enough doctors to last a lifetime. They said the damage was done." "Maybe, but maybe not. Things change. Treatments change. You won't know unless you try." His voice wasn't pleading. It was firm, matter of fact, like a man laying bricks. Olivia wanted to argue, but something in his certainty left her no room. So, a week later, she found herself in Burlington, sitting in a rehab clinic with Matthew at her side. Dr. Raymond leaf-flipped through her old records, his brows knitting. "Mrs. Carter, you should have continued physical therapy immediately after your injury. The spine stiffens, muscles weaken. You've lost critical time." Olivia felt her stomach sink. She looked down at her hands, ashamed as if she'd failed. But the doctor's tone softened. "That doesn't mean it's impossible. It will be hard, harder than it would have been 3 years ago. Painful. But if you commit, if someone makes sure you stick with it, there is still a chance you can improve. Perhaps even walk without support." Her heart gave a painful twist. She wanted to believe him, but fear whispered louder. "And if I fail?" "Then at least you will know you tried," Dr. Lee said. Then he turned to Matthew. "She will need someone to push her, someone who won't let her quit." Matthew nodded without hesitation. "You can count on me." The following week, Matthew built what the doctor had sketched out, a rough rehab frame, welded together by a neighbor who owed him a favor, set up in the spare room. Wooden rails, bars for support, an imitation of the equipment Olivia should have used years ago. It looked brutal, almost like a torture device, and Olivia felt her chest tighten at the sight of it. "This is madness," she whispered. "This," Matthew said firmly, "is your chance." The first attempt nearly broke her. She gripped the bars, her arms trembling, as Matthew braced her waist. When she tried to straighten, a bolt of pain shot through her back, searing down her legs. She gasped and collapsed against the frame, her breath ragged. "I can't," she cried. "It hurts too much." Matthew steadied her, his voice low but unwavering. "Pain means your body's still alive, still fighting. Don't let it win." Day after day, the battle continued. Olivia's knuckles turned white against the bars. Sweat soaked through her clothes. Tears streaked her cheeks as pain clawed at her spine. Some days she screamed. Others she fell silent, retreating inside herself. Each time, she whispered the same words, "I can't. Not anymore." And each time Matthew was there. "Yes, you can. One more step. One more try. Look at me, Olivia. Don't you dare give up now." One evening, after hours of struggle, she collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling, her face wet with tears. "Why are you doing this to me?" she sobbed. "Why won't you let me quit?" Matthew knelt beside her, his voice breaking with the weight of his own scars. "Because I know what quitting costs. I quit once, on myself, on my marriage, on everything. It destroyed me. I won't let you make the same mistake. You deserve more than this pain, Olivia. You deserve to stand again, even if it's only for a single step." Her breath hitched, her hands covering her face. The room was thick with silence, broken only by her quiet sobs. Yet in that silence, a seed took root, a stubborn ember of defiance. The next morning, she rose with the dawn and walked to the rehab frame on her own. She gripped the rails, her jaw set. "One more step," she whispered, echoing his words. And though her body trembled, though the pain sliced through her, she lifted herself again. For the first time in years, Olivia Carter fought not just to survive, but to reclaim the life she thought she had lost. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and slowly, something extraordinary began to happen inside that farmhouse. At first, it was just a flicker of change. Olivia could sit up on her own without clutching the side of the bed. Then she could hold herself steady in the rehab frame for longer stretches. Matthew watched each small victory with the quiet pride of a man guarding a fragile flame. One morning, with sunlight pouring through the lace curtains, she managed to shift her weight and take a step, just one, before collapsing back into Matthew's arms. But that single step was enough. He laughed, a deep sound of triumph, and she, breathless and shocked, laughed with him. By the end of the summer, Olivia could shuffle from the couch to the table, holding onto the chair backs along the way. And one crisp autumn afternoon, she walked to the porch, unaided, and sat in the rocking chair her father had built. Neighbors passing on the road stopped, stunned, as if they'd seen a ghost. "Is that Olivia Carter?" one of them whispered. "Walking," another answered, disbelief heavy in her voice. The gossip spread fast. Some shook their heads, saying it was temporary, that she'd fall back into her broken state soon enough. Others muttered that Matthew must be behind it, driving her too hard. But even those whispers carried a note of awe. Everyone had counted Olivia out. And yet here she was, defying them. Inside the house, life was different now. Matthew still carried groceries and chopped wood, but Olivia moved alongside him more and more. She stirred pots while he chopped vegetables, folded laundry while he stacked firewood. They laughed over small things, a loaf of bread that refused to rise, a hen that kept escaping its coop. Their conversations grew longer, their silences more comfortable. For Olivia, the change was more than physical. With Richard, silence had been heavy, laced with resentment and unmet longing. With Matthew, silence felt safe, like a shared blanket on a cold night. One evening, as the first snow fell across the fields, they sat by the fire. Matthew leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at the flames. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Sometimes I lie awake at night, afraid. Not of prison, not of the mistakes I made, but of you." Olivia turned to him, surprised. "Of me?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "Because I keep thinking, why would a woman like you want a man like me? I've been behind bars. My record will never be clean. What if one day you wake up and regret letting me into your life?" The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. Olivia studied his face, the lines carved by hardship, the eyes shadowed by regret, the hands scarred by work. And yet, beneath all of that, she saw kindness, loyalty, and a strength Richard had never possessed. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his. Her voice trembled, but it carried the weight of certainty. "Matthew, if you call me, I'll go with you. Wherever you ask me to go." He lifted his eyes to hers, searching, as if he couldn't believe she'd said it. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he took her hand, holding it as though it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. The days that followed carried an air of quiet anticipation. Olivia moved with a new confidence, her steps steadier, her laughter brighter. And in town, rumors began to swirl like the snowflakes drifting through the December sky. "Did you hear?" one woman whispered at the diner. "Olivia Carter's ordered a dress. A white one." "A wedding dress," her companion gasped. "That's what they're saying. Imagine a woman who couldn't walk last year, now planning to walk down the aisle." The whispers grew, weaving themselves into every corner of the village. Some scoffed, some smiled, some prayed it was true. And though Olivia heard the gossip, she didn't let it shake her. For the first time in years, she felt the ground steady beneath her feet. Not because her legs were strong, but because her heart finally was. It had been 3 long years since Richard Carter walked out of his farmhouse and out of his wife's life. 3 years spent in the city, chasing the promise of something brighter. At first, it seemed he'd won. a younger woman on his arm, nights out in Burlington and Boston, money flowing as long as he could keep up with her demands. But the shine wore off quickly. The woman who once whispered promises of devotion revealed herself to be merciless. Every dollar he earned disappeared into her hands. When his paycheck shrank, so did her affection. By the time she slammed the door for the last time, Richard was left with nothing but debt, a thinning wallet, and the bitter taste of regret. Winter pressed down on Vermont when Richard finally returned to his hometown. The bus wheezed to a stop at the edge of the village, and he stepped off, collar turned up against the wind. He told himself this wasn't defeat, only a pause, a chance to reclaim what was his. Olivia had no one else. Surely she would still be waiting, bound to the same chair where he'd left her. Maybe she'd even be grateful to see him again. But as he trudged up the familiar dirt road toward the old farmhouse, a prickle of unease crawled up his spine. The place didn't look the same. The sagging porch, he remembered, was gone, replaced with sturdy new steps. The roof gleamed with fresh shingles. The fence had been mended and painted, neat and strong. Richard stopped in the road, blinking against the snowflakes. "How the hell?" he muttered. Had Olivia sold the house? Impossible. It had been her family's place for generations. Maybe a relative had taken over. Or maybe, he dared to hope, the town had rallied around her out of pity, keeping the house in shape until he came back. A greedy thought took hold. If she was still crippled, if she was still dependent, she couldn't have managed this alone, which meant she must have help. And if she had help, he could slide back into the picture, claim his share, maybe even the house itself. After all, wasn't he still her husband? Divorce papers had never been signed. Smirking at the thought, Richard pushed open the gate and stepped into the yard. His boots crunched over the snow, and he pictured Olivia inside, frail and lonely, desperate enough to take him back. But before he could knock, the door opened. Richard froze. There she was, Olivia Carter, framed by the golden lamplight spilling from the house. But she was not the broken woman he remembered. She was radiant, her auburn hair brushed back from her face, her cheeks touched with color. And most shocking of all, she stood tall on her own 2 feet, not a crutch or wheelchair in sight. Richard's mouth fell open. Olivia stepped out onto the porch, pulling a wool shawl around her shoulders. Her movements were steady, graceful, sure. When her eyes met his, there was no trace of desperation, no plea for him to stay. There was only calm recognition, as if she were looking at a stranger passing on the road. "Richard," she said evenly, her voice carrying through the cold air. He struggled to form words. You're walking." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not warm, but strong. "Yes, I am." Richard's chest tightened, panic and disbelief wrestling inside him. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined. He had expected weakness, need, the opening for him to step back in and control the story. Instead, he was staring at a woman transformed, one who no longer needed him, one who looked like she had already left him far behind. The cold cut deeper, and for the first time since he stepped off the bus, Richard wondered if he had made the worst mistake of his life. Richard hadn't planned on coming back so soon after seeing Olivia on her feet. He told himself he needed time, that he would return when he had the right words, when he could convince her that he had changed. But greed and pride gnawed at him. He couldn't let go of the house, the land, or the woman he still thought of as his possession. 2 days later, as the afternoon sun slid low across the snowy hills, Richard walked up the road again. This time, determination steeled his steps. He rehearsed excuses in his mind, claims of loneliness, promises to do better, anything to make her let him back in. But what he saw when the farmhouse door opened shattered whatever script he had prepared. Olivia stepped out, her hand linked with Matthew's. They moved with quiet unity, their shoulders brushing as though they had walked this way for years. And in front of them, Matthew guided a stroller down the porch steps with careful hands. Inside, a baby cooed, bundled in blankets against the cold. Richard's face drained of color. "No," he whispered. Then louder, his voice cracking, "No. What is this?" Olivia met his gaze without flinching. Her eyes no longer held the desperate ache he remembered. They were clear, steady, and full of something he had never earned from her: strength. Richard's pulse thundered. He stormed toward them, his breath sharp in the icy air. "You think you can just replace me? After everything? You're still my wife. This," he pointed at Matthew, his hand shaking with rage. "This criminal doesn't belong here. And a child? Whose child is that, Olivia?" Matthew shifted, placing himself between Richard and Olivia. His stance was calm but immovable like a wall of stone. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of a man who had already survived worse battles than this. "This is my wife," he said, each word deliberate, final. "This is our family. You don't belong here anymore. Don't come back." Richard stopped short, his anger faltering under the sheer conviction in Matthew's tone. The words hit like a hammer, closing every door Richard had imagined he could still force open. He turned desperately to Olivia, searching her face for a crack, for some flicker of the old dependence that had once chained her to him. "Olivia," he begged, his voice trembling now, "you don't mean this. You need me. You always needed me. Don't you remember?" Olivia stepped forward, her hand still resting lightly on the stroller's handle. Her expression was calm, almost serene. "I remember," she said softly. "I remember saving your life on that river. I remember the pain that never left me. I remember waiting for you, believing you cared. And I remember the day you walked away and told me I wasn't enough." Her voice sharpened, not cruel, but undeniable. "That woman doesn't exist anymore. I am not yours to take back, Richard. Not now, not ever." Silence fell over the yard, broken only by the faint cry of the baby in the stroller. Richard's breath hitched. He looked at her, standing tall, standing free, and something inside him cracked. For the first time in years, he felt fear. Not just fear of losing her, but fear of the man at her side. Whispers around town had already reached him. Matthew Hayes, the ex-convict, the man who had once taken a life in a fight. Looking at Matthew now, Richard realized those whispers carried a warning. His knees trembled, his pride crumbling as quickly as his plans. Without another word, he stumbled back a step, then another, until he turned and staggered down the road. Olivia watched him go, her shoulders straight, her face unshaken. Beside her, Matthew rested his hand gently over hers. Together, they stood in the fading light, no longer haunted by Richard's shadow. Richard did not look back. He knew what he had lost, and he knew he could never reclaim it. Richard's figure shrank against the horizon until he was nothing but a blur moving down the snowy road. No one called after him. No one asked where he was going or if he'd return. For the first time in his life, he had no audience, no pity, and no place to belong. By the time he reached the bus stop at the edge of town, the truth weighed on him heavier than the duffel bag over his shoulder. He was a man utterly alone. Back in the village, whispers moved quickly, but they carried a different tone than before. Once, townsfolk had wagged their tongues about Olivia with suspicion, muttering that she'd lost her senses for letting a stranger into her home. Once, they doubted Matthew, warning that ex-cons couldn't be trusted. But now their voices were colored with something else entirely: respect. "Did you see her?" a woman at the diner marveled, leaning across the booth. "Olivia Carter, standing tall, walking on her own. That man she's with, he must have been the one who pushed her back onto her feet." "And the way he stood up to Richard," another replied, shaking his head. "Took guts. The man didn't even flinch." For the first time in years, the town wasn't talking about Olivia as a victim. They were talking about her as someone who had one. Life in the farmhouse took on a warmth that spread far beyond its walls. Neighbors began to stop by, not with pity, but with casseroles, warm bread, and heartfelt congratulations. Mrs. Hensley, once Olivia's fiercest critic, came with a pie and tears in her eyes. I was wrong about him, she admitted, nodding toward Matthew. And I was wrong about you too. You're stronger than any of us ever knew. When the church bells rang one crisp Saturday morning, the pews filled with faces from every corner of town. Olivia stood at the front in a simple cream dress, her auburn hair tucked beneath a veil, her steps measured but steady as she walked down the aisle. At the altar, Matthew waited in a dark suit borrowed from the pastor's son, his hands trembling not with fear, but with awe. The vows were short, spoken with a conviction that silenced every whisper. When Matthew said, "I will stand with you in strength and in weakness for all the days of my life," there wasn't a dry eye in the room. And when Olivia answered, "I will walk with you wherever the path leads," even the skeptical shook their heads in wonder. Afterward, the churchyard rang with laughter. Children chased each other between the gravestones. Women clutched Olivia's hands. Men clapped Matthew on the back. No one spoke of his past that day. They spoke instead of their future, of a family forged not in ease but in fire, tested and found unbreakable. Seasons turned as they always do. Winter melted into spring, and spring swelled into a lush Vermont summer. By the time autumn rolled across the hills, Olivia's life had blossomed into something she once thought impossible. The farmhouse glowed with fresh paint, its windows bright, its garden overflowing with pumpkins and chrysanthemums. Inside, a crib stood by the window, and the soft laughter of a baby filled the rooms like music. One golden morning, with leaves drifting down in shades of amber and scarlet, Olivia stepped outside. She no longer needed Matthew's steady arm to hold her, but he offered it anyway, pushing the stroller with their child bundled inside. They walked down the gravel path together, the cool air brushing their cheeks. Olivia paused, looking out across the rolling fields. 3 years ago, she had watched this same landscape through a fog of pain, convinced her life had ended. Now, standing here with Matthew and their child, she felt something entirely different, a surge of quiet triumph, a trust in tomorrow. Her eyes shimmered in the sunlight, and a small, unshakable smile touched her lips. She had been broken, abandoned, told she was less than whole. And yet here she was, stronger than ever, walking her own path. Because true strength, she realized, had never been about flawless bodies or perfect lives. It lived in the courage to rise again, in the heart's stubborn refusal to surrender, and above all, in the choice to love herself, to love the man who saw her worth, and to love the life that was still hers to claim. As Matthew slipped his hand into hers and their baby gurgled softly in the stroller, Olivia Carter knew her story was no longer one of loss. It was one of renewal, of sweet, quiet revenge against every doubt, every cruel word, every man who thought she couldn't stand again. And with that knowledge, she walked forward into the morning, her eyes lit with the unshakable faith of a woman who had finally, beautifully come home to herself